The auction house smelled of smoke and fear. Rows of candles burned along the walls, their light flickering over faces that had come to buy and sell things that should never have been for sale. At the center of the room stood a wooden platform, and on it stood Alira. Her wrists were bound in silver chains that burned her skin with every movement. Silver was poison to wolves, and the metal had been wrapped tightly enough to keep her spirit dim, her strength gone, her voice quiet. She had learned, over the past few months, not to look at the men and women who came to examine her like livestock. Looking only invited cruelty. So she kept her eyes on the floor and waited for whatever came next, the way she had waited every night since she was taken. She had once been part of a small pack in the eastern hills, a place of quiet forests and gentle rivers. Her parents had been ordinary wolves, not warriors, not nobles, just people who loved their daughter and taught her to run beneath the moon. That life had ended. The night raiders crossed the border and dragged half the pack away in nets and chains. Alira had been 8 years old. She had spent the following years being sold from one place to another, passed between hands that saw her only as property. Now, at 20, she stood on the platform with no expectation of rescue. Rescue was a story told to children. It was not something that happened to girls like her. The auctioneer's voice rang out, announcing her as though she were an object with a price tag. Bids began to rise. Whispered numbers passed between buyers eager to add a wolf to their collection. Alira closed her eyes and tried to think of the forest of her childhood, the smell of pine and river water, anything but the room she stood in. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the heavy doors at the back of the hall slammed open. Every head turned. A tall man stood in the doorway, alone, wearing no armor and bringing no guards. Yet the air in the room shifted the moment he stepped inside. His presence alone seemed to press down on every wolf present, an instinctive recognition of rank and power that made even the boldest buyers lower their eyes. Whispers spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. It was King Draven, ruler of the Ashwood Pack, the strongest and most respected territory in the north. He never attended events like this. He never left his stronghold for anything less than war. Yet here he was, his gaze sweeping across the room until it landed on the platform, on her, and something in his expression froze. He did not blink. He did not look away. For a long moment, he simply stared at Alira, as though he had seen a ghost, or perhaps something he had feared he would never see again. The auctioneer, sensing an opportunity, tried to raise the price further, praising her strength and her bloodline to the newly arrived king. Draven did not let him finish. He named a sum so large that the room fell utterly silent, a number that could have purchased half the buildings on that street. No one dared bid against him. No one would have dared, even if they could afford to. He walked forward without hurry, climbed the steps to the platform, and knelt in front of Alira. She flinched, expecting rough hands, but instead, he reached for the silver cuffs binding her wrists and broke them apart with his bare fingers. The silver burned him instantly, hissing against his skin, yet he did not let go until both cuffs fell away and clattered to the floor. Alira stared at him, too stunned to speak. No one had ever hurt themselves to free her. No one had ever looked at her the way he was looking at her now, like she was something precious rather than something owned. He removed his own cloak and settled it over her shoulders, covering the thin, worn dress she had been forced to wear. Then, without a word of explanation to the room, he lifted her carefully into his arms and carried her out of the auction house, ignoring the stunned murmurs that followed them into the night. Alira did not know what to think. Part of her expected this to be another trick, another cage with different walls. Yet the arms holding her were gentle, and the man carrying her walked as though she weighed nothing at all, as though carrying her was the easiest and most natural thing in the world. They traveled through the night to the Ashwood stronghold, a place built into the side of a mountain, its halls lit with warm firelight instead of the cold torches of the auction house. Draven brought her not to a cell, but to a large room with a soft bed, warm blankets, and a fire already burning in the hearth. A healer arrived shortly after to tend to the burns on her wrists, and food was brought that she was actually permitted to eat slowly, without fear of it being taken away. Still, Alira could not relax. She sat on the edge of the bed that first night, wrapped in blankets, watching the door as though someone might come through it with new chains. When Draven returned to check on her, she asked the only question that mattered. Why had he done this? He did not answer that night. He only told her to rest, that no one in his stronghold would harm her, and that she was free to leave whenever she wished, though he hoped she would choose to stay, at least for a little while. Then he left, and Alira lay awake for hours, trying to understand a kindness she had no experience recognizing. The days that followed were strange in their gentleness. Alira was given new clothes, simple and warm, nothing like the fine gowns wealthy owners had once dressed her in to increase her value. She was allowed to walk the grounds of the stronghold freely, escorted only if she asked for company. The pack members she passed treated her with quiet respect, though she noticed the way they watched her with curious, searching eyes, as though trying to solve a puzzle she did not know she was part of. Draven visited her each evening. He rarely stayed long, and he said little of substance, but he always came, always asked how her day had been, always noticed small things, like the burns healing on her wrists or the way she avoided the color silver even in jewelry. He never touched her without permission, never pushed her to speak more than she wanted to. It was the careful patience of a man handling something fragile, something he was afraid of breaking. Alira found herself watching him too. He was known throughout the Northern Territories as a hard ruler, unshakable in negotiations, fierce in battle, and utterly uninterested in matters of courtship. Pack elders had tried for years to arrange a match for him, offering daughters of neighboring alphas, promising alliances and strength. He had refused every single one, and no one understood why a king in the prime of his life would choose to remain alone. No one, it seemed, except perhaps Alira herself, though she did not yet know it. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, she finally worked up the courage to ask him directly. She found him in the study, papers spread across his desk, a fire crackling behind him. She stood in the doorway and asked again the question that had followed her since midnight in that auction house. Why me? Why had a king who could have anyone spend a fortune and risk his own hands to free a stranger he had never met? Draven set down his pen. For a long moment he was quiet, and Alira thought perhaps he would avoid the question again. Instead, he gestured for her to sit, and when she did, he began to speak in a low, steady voice, the kind used for stories that mattered. 10 years ago, he told her, before he was king, before his father had passed the crown to him, he had been a young warrior sent to guard the eastern border during a skirmish with raiders. In the chaos of that night, he had come across a small group of children being herded away in nets. He had fought to free them, and in the confusion, his hand had brushed against the hand of a young girl, barely more than a child herself. In that single touch, something had happened that he had never told anyone. A bond had begun to form, faint and unfinished, the kind that only happens between fated mates. He had felt it settle into his chest like a thread connecting him to her, and in the same instant, the raiders had regrouped and pulled her away before he could learn her name or finish freeing her. He had searched for her in the years that followed, quietly, without telling his father or the pack elders, using scouts and trackers and every resource he had access to. He never found her. As the search grew longer, most people around him assumed he had simply lost interest in marriage altogether, and he let them believe it, because the truth was harder to explain. He could not court anyone else, while that thread in his chest remained, unbroken and aching, tying him to someone he could not name. When he became king, the pressure to marry only grew, yet he refused every offer, every carefully arranged meeting, because some part of him refused to accept that the bond had been for nothing. He told Alira that people had started calling him cold, unfeeling, uninterested in love, and he had let them believe that too, because it was easier than explaining a decade of searching for a stranger he had touched for only a few seconds. Then, tonight, word had reached him of an auction happening at midnight, wolves being sold like cattle in a hidden hall outside his territory. He had gone, as he sometimes did, hoping to interrupt such gatherings when he could. He had not expected anything more than that. The moment he stepped through the doors, the thread in his chest had pulled taut, alive again, after 10 years of silence, and he had known, without needing to be told, that she was standing on that platform. Alira sat frozen as he finished speaking, pieces of her own scattered memory rising to the surface. She remembered fragments of that night on the border, a hand reaching for hers in the dark, a warmth she had never been able to explain to herself in all the years since. She had been so young, so frightened, that the memory had blurred into something she assumed was a dream. It had not been a dream. She reached out slowly and placed her hand against his, the same way she imagined it had happened all those years ago. The moment their palms touched, something settled inside her chest, a feeling of rightness she had never experienced in her entire life, not once, in all her years of being passed from place to place. Javan's breath caught. He told her, quietly, that she owed him nothing. That her freedom was not a debt to be repaid, that he had not paid for her to claim her as a possession, only to give her back the choice that had been stolen from both of them a decade ago. Whatever she decided, whether she stayed at the stronghold or chose to leave and build a new life elsewhere, he would respect it. But Alira did not want to leave. For the first time since she was 8 years old, she felt something like home settling around her, not because of the warm room or the soft bed or the freedom to walk without chains, but because of the man sitting across from her, who had spent 10 years refusing to give up on a bond most people would have long since abandoned. She told him, in a voice steadier than she expected, that she had felt the same pull the instant he walked into that auction house, though she had not understood what it meant until now. She told him she was tired of being taken from place to place, and that for the first time, she wanted to choose to stay somewhere, choose it for herself, without fear driving the decision. Draven reached for her hand again, and this time, neither of them let go. In the weeks that followed, the bond between them grew stronger, no longer a faint, unfinished thread, but something whole and steady. The pack, once puzzled by their king's decade of solitude, began to understand, as they watched Alira slowly become part of stronghold life, first as a guest, then as someone the pack members greeted warmly, then eventually, as their future queen. On the night the bond was fully sealed, the entire pack gathered on the mountainside beneath a full moon. Alira stood beside Draven, no longer the frightened girl from the auction platform, but a woman who had found her place in the world after a lifetime of searching for it. As the pack howled together in celebration below, Draven took her hand and told her that he had spent 10 years believing he was searching for a stranger. He understood now that he had been searching for her all along, and that the wait, however long and painful, had been worth every year, because it had led him back to the one person the bond had chosen for him from the very beginning. Alira smiled, leaning against him as the moonlight settled over the mountains, finally, truly, home. In the months that followed, life at the Ashwood stronghold changed for Alira, in ways she was still learning to accept. She woke each morning, without the old fear that had followed her for so many years, the fear of a door opening to reveal a new owner, a new set of chains, a new place to be sold. Instead, she woke to sunlight through tall windows and the quiet sounds of a household that had, slowly and without her quite noticing, become her own. She spent many afternoons in the stronghold gardens, learning the names of pack members who greeted her with genuine warmth, rather than the wary curiosity of her first days there. An older woman named Sela, who had cared for the gardens for decades, took a liking to her and shared stories of the pack's history, including memories of a young Draven who had once been far more talkative before the weight of searching had settled onto his shoulders. Hearing these stories helped Alira understand the man she had chosen, not just as a king who had rescued her, but as someone who had carried his own private grief for a decade without ever once giving up hope. There were difficult moments too. Alira sometimes woke from dreams of the auction platform, her wrists aching with a memory of chains long since removed. On those nights, Draven would sit beside her until the fear passed, never rushing her, never demanding she explain more than she was ready to share. Slowly, the nightmares came less often, replaced by dreams of forests and rivers, the kind of peaceful dreams she had not allowed herself in years. The pack elders, who had once pressed Draven so persistently to marry for the sake of alliances and strength, found themselves silenced by the sight of their king with Alira. None could argue with a bond as old and as real as the one connecting their king to the woman he had crossed half the northern territories to find. As the season turned, and the mountains around the stronghold grew green again, Alira often found herself standing on the same balcony where she and Draven had first watched the dawn together, as a bonded pair. She would think back to the girl on the auction platform, chained and certain that rescue was nothing more than a story told to children, and marvel at how far she had traveled since that midnight in the auction hall. She understood now that Draven had not simply bought her freedom that night. He had spent 10 patient years, refusing to let go of a promise made in a single, fleeting touch, and in doing so, he had given her back not just her freedom, but a future she had once believed impossible. And as she stood beside him beneath the mountain sky, she knew without doubt that she would spend the rest of her days grateful that he had searched for her, alone, until the very end.